So as we connect all of these things together, earth science connections, and we're going to look at the passage down below. Now, energy from the sun causes water to constantly evaporate from the earth's surface. Water enters the atmosphere in the form called water vapor. Approximately 90% of the water vapor evaporates from oceans, lakes, and rivers, and about 10% evaporates from the surface of plants through a process called transpiration. Clouds form when water vapor rises, cools, and condenses into droplets around dust particles in the atmosphere. Water falls from the clouds to the Earth's surface as precipitation in the forms such as rain or snow. Some surface water percolates or moves through the soil and enters groundwater. Other water flows over the Earth's surface as runoff and enters streams, rivers, lakes, and oceans. And then the cycle continues. So let's take a look at these terms and see if we can define them a little closer. So the first one is evaporate. And in this one, energy from the sun converts liquid water to gas. So the key here is we're going from a liquid to a gas when we're talking about evaporation. Now, water vapor is that gaseous form of water, okay? So when we're talking about water vapor, we're talking about how it is in its gaseous form. Next, we have transpiration, and this is water evaporating from plants. Okay, so this is how water vapor enters the atmosphere from plants and not just from heating up the liquid water on the surface. All right, so condensation is when water vapor cools and condenses into clouds. So this is how our clouds form from water vapor turning into clouds. Precipitation is liquid water falling from the clouds. This could be in the form of rain, snow, sleet. Percolates is when water moving through the soil and enters the groundwater. And finally, we have runoff, and this is just liquid water flowing over the surface. So hopefully that helps you out with those different water terms. Now, one of the water cycle jobs that you can actually have is something called water engineering. Now, water engineering is a civil engineer position who creates a system that ensures that people have a continuous supply of clean, uncontaminated water and are called water resource engineers. So these people are pretty much responsible for creating the clean drinking water that we have. So another cycle that we have is the carbon and oxygen cycle. And the carbon and oxygen often combine to form essential molecules for life. So this includes carbon dioxide and simple sugars. And these cycles of these two elements are shown below. So let's look at different ways that CO2 can enter the atmosphere. First one is combustion. So when we burn fossil fuels, we are releasing the CO2 that was once trapped inside of the ground. All right. We also have the destruction of vegetation. When we burn or even destroy vegetation, we're releasing that into the atmosphere. Another one we have is respiration. When we breathe out, we are producing CO2 that enters into the atmosphere. And the final one, and another one we have is decay. So when an organism dies, that carbon is released from that animal in the form of CO2, which is released in the atmosphere. The last one we have is diffusion, going from the water of the oceans into the atmosphere. So these are different ways that we can add atmosphere to, or add CO2 to our atmosphere. So from this, what are ways that it leaves the atmosphere? One of the big ones is photosynthesis. Plants performing photosynthesis trap CO2 or use CO2 and convert that into oxygen, which then brings the CO2 out of the atmosphere. The other one is by producing bicarbonate, which is an acid that actually makes our oceans much more acidic. All right. So again, these are two ways that we can take it out, as well as the numerous ways that which we can put it back in. So photosynthesis and cellular respiration are important. And they are important because they are really big, important components of the carbon cycle. So during photosynthesis, plants and algae convert carbon dioxide and water into carbohydrates and release oxygen back into the air. So plants absorb CO2 and release oxygen, limiting the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. During cellular respiration, which is what animals do, living things consume oxygen and then they release CO2 back into the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide enters the atmosphere as dead organisms decay, and carbon enters the soil through the decomposition of plants and animals. Carbon enters a long-term cycle when organic matter is buried underground and is converted to fossil fuels. So carbon dioxide enters the atmosphere through the combustion or burning of those fossil fuels. And finally, carbon dioxide and oxygen enter long-term cycles when they are combined with calcium to create calcium carbonate, which is what seashells are made of. Now, an example of a long-term storage one that we do have are the White Cliffs of Dover. All of these white cliffs are made of calcium carbonate. So again, there's a large amount of CO2 that is stored inside of these White Cliffs of Dover. So the next cycle we are looking at is the nitrogen cycle. Now, most of the Earth's nitrogen is found in the atmosphere, about 71%. And before it can be used by plants and animals, nitrogen must be modified. So there are these organisms called nitrogen fixers, or through a process called nitrogen fixation, nitrogen gas, N2, is converted to ammonium. And now it is able to be used by most of the organisms in the food web. And this is done by specialized bacteria in an ecosystem. So another term that we're looking at here is nitrification. And nitrification is the chemical process that turns ammonium into nitrogen-oxygen compounds like NO2 and NO3. Nitrification is what allows plants to use these nitrogen that was once in the air. And then finally, we have denitrification, and this is when some bacteria convert NO2 and NO3 back to nitrogen gas. So if we take a look at this chart over here, right, we start with nitrogen in the atmosphere. And what happens is there's the nitrogen fixators that are making this stuff available to the plants, all right? So when that process occurs and nitrification occurs that allows that to be available, it then is used, and then eventually denitrification occurs, which sends it back into the atmosphere. So here would be nitrification, which is how those organisms are able to use it. So the next cycle we have is the phosphorus cycle. So the phosphorus is an element that is essential for the growth and development of organisms. So we have a few natural ways that which this is produced. Some natural ways would be the weathering of rocks, or the erosion of rocks slowly adds phosphorus to the soil. All right. So again, this natural process is very slow and provides enough phosphorus for most plants to survive. Now, humans have sped up this process. and they've done so by phosphate mining, as well as sewage treatment and fertilizer productions, and this has severely increased the amount of available phosphorus in the soil. Now, what this does is it could lead to some really big problems, such as algae blooms. Now, too much phosphorus can result in algae overgrowth, which upsets the balance of an ecosystem. And as all of this algae starts to break down and die and decompose, it absorbs all the oxygen. And pretty much what happens is because there's no oxygen in the water, all these plants begin to die off. So, in summary, biochemical cycles exchange important nutrients between the abiotic and biotic parts of the ecosystem. The carbon and oxygen cycle are closely intertwined. Again, you breathe out CO2 for respiration. Plants take in CO2 during photosynthesis and produce oxygen, which is what we breathe in. The nitrogen gas is limited in its ability to enter biotic portions of the environment, which is why we have those nitrogen fixating gases. And phosphorus and carbon have short-term and long-term cycles to allow it to enter and leave the atmosphere. So hopefully this helps you out, and this concludes Module 2 in the Principles of Ecology. Hopefully these slides help you out. This is Mr. O'Brien signing off.